Hello, BookTube. It's time for another essay, and we're staying with Augustine Birrell for some of his bookish essays. Today, it comes from In the Name of the Bodleian and Other Essays, published by Elliot in 1905, and it's called Bookworms. And I hope it's a bit longer than yesterday's, but I hope to add something else from a different publication, a few other things. We'll see how timing goes, though. Bookworms. Great is bookishness and the charm of books. No doubt there are times and seasons in the lives of most reading men that they rebel against the dust of libraries and kick against the pricks of those monstrously accumulated heaps of words. We all know the dark hour, when the vanity of learning and the childishness of merely literary things are brought home to us in such a way as almost to avail to put the pale student out of conceit with his books, and to make him turn from his best-loved authors, as from a friend who has outstayed his welcome, whose carriage we wish were at the door. In these unhappy moments we are apt to call to mind the shrewd men we have known, who have been our blithe companions on breezy fells, heathery moor, and by the stream side, who could neither read nor write, or who, at all events, but rarely practiced those Cadmean arts. Yet they could tell the time of day by the sun, and steer through the silent night by the stars, and each of them had, as Emerson, a very bookish person, has said, a dial in his mind for the whole bright calendar of the year. How racy was their talk, how wise their judgments on men and things, how well they did all that at the moment seemed worth doing, how universally useful was their general experience, their acquired learning. How wily were these illiterates in the pursuit of game, how ready in their emergency. What a charm there is about out-of-doors company. Who would not sooner have spent a summer's day with Sir Walter's humble friend, Tom Purdy, than with Mr. William Wordsworth of Rydal Mount. It is, we can only suppose, reflections such as these that make country gentlemen and farmers the sworn foes they are of education and the enemies of school boards. I only indicate this line of thought to condemn it. Such temptations come from below. Great, we repeat, is bookishness and the charm of books. Even the writings of the ponderous writings of the portentous parson, the Reverend T.F. Dibdin, with all their lumbering gaiety and dust-choked rapture over first editions, are not hastily to be sent packing to the auction room. Much red gold did they cost us, these poorly tomes in bygone days, and on our shelves they shall remain till the end of our time, unless our creditors intervene, were it only to remind us of years when our enthusiasms were pure, though our tastes may have been crude. Some years ago, Mr. Blades, the famous printer and caxonist, published in vellum covers a small volume which he christened The Enemies of Books. It made many friends, and now a revised and enlarged version is commonly form adorned with pictures, and with a few prefatory words by Dr. Garnett, has made its appearance. Mr. Blades himself has left this world for a better one, where, so piety bids us believe, neither fire nor water nor worm can despoil or destroy the pages of heavenly wisdom. But the book collector must not be caught nursing merely sublunary hopes. There is every reason to believe that in the realms of the blessed, the library, like that of Major Ponto, will be small, though well selected. Mr. Blades had, as his friend Dr. Garnett observes, a debonair spirit. There was nothing fiery or controversial about him. His attitude towards the human race and his treatment of rare books was rather mournful than angry. For example, under the head of fire, he has occasion to refer to that great destruction of books of magic which took place in Ephesus, to which St. Luke has called attention in his Acts of the Apostles. Mr. Blades describes this holocaust as righteous and only permits himself to say in a kind of undertone that he feels a certain mental disquietude and uneasiness at the thought of the loss of more than £18,000 worth of books, which could not but have thrown much light, had they been preserved, on many curious questions of folklore. Personally, I am dead against the burning of books. A far worse, because a corrupt, proceeding was the scandalously horrid fate that befell the monastic libraries in our distinguishingly conducted, even if generally beneficent, Reformation. The greedy nobles and landed gentry who grabbed the ancient foundations of the old religion cared nothing for the books they found cumbering on the walls, and either devoted them to vile domestic uses or sold them in shiploads across the seas. It may well be that the monks, fine lusty fellows, cared more for the contents of their fish ponds than of their libraries, but at all events they left the books alone to take their chance. They did not rub their boots with them or sell them at a price of old paper. A man need not have a very debonair spirit who does not lose his temper over our blessed Reformation. Mr. Blades, on the whole, managed to keep his. Passing from fire, Mr. Blades has a good deal to say about water and the harm it has been allowed to do in our collegiate and cathedral libraries. With really creditable composure he writes, quote, "Few old libraries in England are now so thoroughly neglected as were 30 years ago. The state of many of our collegiate and cathedral libraries was at one time simply appalling. I could mention many instances, one especially, where a window having been left broken for a long time, the ivy had pushed through and crept over a row of books, each of which was worth hundreds of pounds. In rainy weather the water was conducted as by a pipe along the tops of the books and soaked through the whole." End quote. Ours is indeed a learned church. Fancy the mingled amazement and dismay of the dean and chapter when they were informed that all this mouldering literary trash had boodle in it. In another, quote, "In another and smaller collection, the rain came through onto a bookcase through a skylight, saturating continually the top shelf containing Caxton and other English books, one of which, although rotten, was sold soon after by permission of the charity commissioners for £200. End quote. Oh, those scoundrelly charity commissioners! How impertinent has been their interference with the loving care and guardianship of the Lord's property by his lawful consecrated ministers. By the side of these anthropoid apes, the genuine bookworm, the paper-eating insect, ravenous as he once was, has done comparatively little mischief. Very little seems known of the creature, though the purchaser of Mr. Blades' book becomes the owner of a life-size portrait of the miscreant in one, at all events, of his many shapes. Mr. Birrell of Northampton sent Mr. Blades in 1879 by post a fat little worm he had found in an old volume. Mr. Blades did all, and more than all, that could be expected of a humane man to keep the creature alive, actually feeding him with fragments of Caxton's and 17th century literature. But it availed not, for in 3 weeks the thing died, and as the result of a post-mortem was declared to be Ecope fera pseudo pretella. Some years later, Dr. Garnett, who has spent a long life obliging men of letters, sent Mr. Blades 2 Athenian worms, which had travelled to the country in a Hebrew commentary, but lovely and pleasant in their lives, in their deaths they were not far divided. Mr. Blades at least mourned their loss. The energy of bookworms, like that of men, greatly varies. Some go much further than others. However fair they may start out at the same folio, they end very differently. Once upon a time, 212 worms began to eat their way through a stout folio printed in the year 1477 by Peter Scoffer of Mentz. It was an ungodly race they ran, but let me trace their progress. By the time the 61st page was reached, all but 4 had given up, either slinking back the way they came or perishing en route. By the time the 86th page had been reached, but 1 was left, and he evidently on his last legs, for he failed to pierce his way through page 87. At the other end of the same book, another lot of worms began to bore, hoping, I presume, to meet at the middle, like the makers of submarine titles, but the last survivor of this gang only reached the 69th page from the end. Mr. Blades was of opinion that all these worms belonged to the Anobium pertinax. Worms have fallen upon evil days, for whether modern books are readable or not, they have long since ceased to be edible. The worm's instinct forbids him to quote, eat the china clay, the bleaches, the plaster of Paris, the sulphite of Barrett's, the scores of adulterants now used to mix with the fibre, end quote. Alas, poor worm! Alas, poor author! Neglected by the Anoborium pertanax, what chance is there for anyone, man or beast, 100 years hence, reaching his 87th page? Time fails me to refer to bookbinders, frontispiece collectors, servants, and children's, and other enemies of books. But the volume I refer to is to be had of the booksellers, and is a pleasant volume worthy of all commendation. In its last words set me thinking. They are, quote, even a millionaire will cease his toils, lengthen his life, and add 100% to his daily pleasures if he becomes a bibliophile. While to the man of business, with a taste for books, who through the day has struggled in the battle of life, with all his irritating rebuffs and anxieties, what a blessed season of pleasurable repose opens upon him as he enters his sanctum, where every article wafts him a welcome, and every book is a personal friend. As for the millionaire, I frankly say I have no desire his life should be lengthened, and care nothing about adding 100% to his daily pleasures. He is a nuisance, for he has raised prices nearly 100%. We cursed the day when he was told it was the thing to buy old books, and if he must buy old books, why is he not content with the works of Gibbon, Hume, and Robinson, and Flavius Josephus, that learned Jew? But it is not the millionaire who set me thinking. It is the harassed man of business. And what I am wondering is whether in sober truth and earnestness it is possible for him, as he shuts his library door and finds himself inside, to forget his rebuffs and anxieties, his maturing bills and overdue argosies, and to lose himself over a favorite volume. The article that wafts him welcome I take to be his pipe. That he will put the article into his mouth and smoke it, I have no matter of doubt. My dread is lest in 10 minutes' time the book should have dropped onto his lap and the man's eyes be staring into the fire. But for all that, great is bookishness and the charm of books. He says the article, where the author he quotes, it says, the anxieties in every article wafts him a welcome, and every book is a personal friend. He equates that to a pipe, but to me, it's the smell of books. Every article is the book, but maybe it is something different. Now, I'm hoping I got time to read something else. This is from the Gentleman's Magazine. I did something about this on a previous video, but because he talked about bookworms, this is some small articles from the Bookworm of 1819, the first one, by a John Smith of St. John's College, Cambridge. And he starts out with a quote. It's called The Bookworm. He starts out with a quote, "Happy Guscardo, for thou art among the number of those old blinding seeky bibliomaniacs, who, if they chance not to stumble upon any of the forementioned delectable fragments, have yet perhaps the felicity to pounce upon a worm, not of the stupendous dimensions of that splendistone Hoff's, but of pearl-like transparency of color, obliquely of movement, and of an insatiable spirit of devouration." And then he's got 2 lines of poetry: "Never ending, still beginning, fighting still, and still destroying." And it's Dibdin, which he dismays. And this is Dibdin's Bibliomania. Dibdin's Bibliograph, Decameron, Volume 2, page 437. But here's the article. "Ever since I read the curious and interesting account of the bookworm, which follows the above quotation, I have been diligent in my search for one of those far-famed, and it would seem, rarely discovered foes in the annals of the olden time. Many ponderous volumes, whose pages presented prima facie evidence of the ravages of these destructive insects, have undergone the most scrutinizing investigation, and often, after having followed the scent and traced the prowler through his mazy windings in thick wood and scattered leaves, I have been obliged to give up the pursuit on finding that the wily elf had left his cover. Nevertheless, fortune frequently smiles upon us when we least expect it, and throws things in our way which we have repeatedly sought in vain. And so it happened to me on Saturday the 7th inst., for I was destined on that day to experience the felicity of being able to apply to myself the admirable exclamation which I have adopted as the model of this communication. But where does the gentle reader suppose that I found this mortal enemy of bibliomaniacs? The Roxburgh will probably guess that he was feasting on a morsel of Caxton or other black letter delicacy. Not so, good sir, and I am mighty glad thereof. The grave and learned clerk may conjecture that he had crossed the seas from Holland, Germany, or France, and was regaling on the solid repast which the massy tomes of Leusden, Bocart, Hoffman, and Stevens so aptly afford. Or perhaps the minutely investigating the subtle necessities and picking holes in the tedious sophistry of the German critics. In verity thou art mistaken. Perchance, affirms the lawyer, you attacked him whilst nibbling at the folios of old Pierin's records. No, honest sir, and against this judgment I must enter a writ of error. The bibliophist will naturally surmise that he was caught on the shelves of the University College Library. Nay, in good truth, all these suppositions, however reasonable, are equally distant from the real circumstances of the case, which will excite surprise in most persons, and very likely fear in some. For this said book-loving child was smugly concealed where, of all places, in the whole range of paper and print, one would least expect. For I espied him taking a nap in the half-bound copy of Wall's Ceremonies of the University, 1798. I do not think he has been long there, but had perhaps under the influence of innate principle. Locke, I believe, does not deny its existence in bookworms of this species, or sympathetic affinity had migrated from some rotten black-letter sheet to an ancient and time-worn forms of alma mater. You, Mr. Urban, may conceive the triumph with which I captured his literary foe, and can participate in the joy which filled my heart when I continuously enclosed him not in a deal. And he's got some footnotes, but they are very obscure, so I'll pass those. He continues, this is not in a deal, but in a beacon beechen box, where he was quickly provided with a dinner consisting of a few choicely culled and well-wormed scraps. He seemed satisfied with his situation, and on the next morning I was looking over the rest of my tattered volumes for the purpose of supplying the little creature with a change of his Sunday meal. I chanced to meet with a small Greek book, which bore self-evident testimony of the labors of some of these belligerents, and who had not only penetrated through the philosophy of Pythagoras, but had even ventured to take off the wonderful arguments of Demosthenes. Directed by the index, I traced their insinuations ad finem, and where, to my great gratification, I discovered not only another live worm, but also a dead fly or moth, which probably was his parent. My other books were afterwards examined over and over again, but in vain, and I think I have these curiosities by a microscope. I yesterday examined both these curiosities by a microscope, and though I am not acquainted with entomology, I will endeavor to give you as good an account as I am able. This worm, which looks much like a flibert maggot, is of a pearly white color. The body, which seems to be formed of scaly rings, which are capable of being contracted or extended at pleasure, is of a round appearance at the back and flattish beneath, and it's covered in white downy hairs. Its thickness increases towards the head, which juts out of the body, and it is of darker hue approaching the drab, and the mouth and eyes are of brownish mahogany cast. It appears to be furnished with two tusks of a saw-like form, with which it pierces the wood, leather, and paper, which form its food, and I am led to make this conclusion from observing the dust in which it has embedded when I found it, which through the microscope clearly resembles saw filings. It moves rather slowly through, though provided with 3 pair of thin, wiry legs, and when touched, it curls up its body into a globular form. Both these worms are nearly alike, only the last I found appears to be younger than the other. They are both on the same box, and I have divided by a portion of card. The little one seems anxious to get to the other, and just to gratify my curiosity, I put them together for a minute, and the younger approached his senior and saluted him with great affection, as if claiming some relationship with him. And the elder would not brook, and seemingly conscious of the superiority which his residence in the university had conferred upon him, he coldly avoided the Grecian trio, and behaved to him much as the same way a senior soph would to a young and uninitiated freshman. Now, good Mr. Urban, after having so long trespassed upon your patience, I merely add that I will take great care of both of them, for the purpose of watching their supposed metamorphosis from the creeping worm to the flying moth, and in case they should, whilst in my position, follow the example of other literary characters and keep a journal, I may perhaps hereafter send you an extract or two from it. I would premise that I will probably contain, like those of the rest of the species, whether by pedicle or polybectal, in a relation of their proceedings in poring over and cramming up the literature of the ages and countries. I conclude by stating that the worms are now quite well and hearty, and I shall be most happily to gratify the curiosity of the bibliographer or naturalist by an inspection of them. And John Smith, as it says, St. John's College. I can't find anything else that he continued, but there's another one here, 1792. An able mathematician not long since deceased, and one of those thriftless pupils survives to tell you an anecdote, who's careful to have all his books bound in Russian leather. The late master of his college, inquiring the reason, was gravely informed that it would preserve them from maggots. "The prithee," said the master, "get a Russian leather cap." your present correspondent, who never saw the good effects of either the binding or cap, and who is now not unacquainted with some ancient and considerable libraries in his neighborhood, will be very glad if some of your ingenious friends can suggest better means of preserving old books from the depredations of the worm, or as a step towards such a discovery of any of them will communicate to your readers any observation that they tend to elucidate the natural history of the bookworm. And then in 1844, in page 2 of your present volume, a correspondent wishes to learn the most effectual means of destroying the grubs which eat holes in books, and of preventing their attacks. Having suffered considerable damage in this way, the subject was forced into my attention, and the result of the experience is much at his service. Keeping books in a damp room and moving them but seldom will render them particularly liable to attack. For many years I have employed a solution of corrosive sublimate of mercury in clean rainwater, applied with a pen or feather to destroy the grubs, both in books and furniture, and have applied it generally on book covers as well as on articles of furniture, by means of sponge tied to the end of a short stick to avoid wetting the fingers. An ounce of the sublimate, which will not cost more than 6d, may be added to a quarter bottle full of water. This quantity would saturate an imperial pint of water of the common temperature, but boiling water would dissolve 1/3 of its own weight. To dissolve it speedily, therefore, the water may be warmed. This is the solution used by Cayenne to pickle and preserve timber, but I had employed it long before his patent, in consequence of reading Thénard's Traité de Chien, tome 3, page 643, first edition, 1815, of the method first used by Dr. Chaucer for preserving dead bodies by putting them into saturated solution of the salt. Thénard also says there he has had a human head thus preserved, which had has been exposed to the sun and rain for a great many years, without having undergone the slightest alteration. It was by little change in appearance, and was easily recognized, although the flesh has become almost as hard as wood. The mischievous insect which has been most injurious in my case appears to be the hottest days of the summer, in a small moppish beetle of a coffee brown color, and upon the 1/10 of an inch in length. But the greatest mischief is done in the spring, when it appears in the larva state as a white grub, a brown speck on the head. I can immediately detect the beetles in the wing. It's at first they are plump and of crushed, exhibit eggs on the short time, probably after their eggs are deposited, they may be found dead near a window and merely in empty crust. I have bestowed much attention upon them, but have been unable to detect them laying their eggs, nor am I certain that I have found their eggs in place and they are hatched. They are the Pinus perfex of entomologists, the woodfetter or woodworm. The solution should contain less sublimate, and the proportion before mentioned, when used in the wash to cover of bound books, 2 drachms and 1/2 pint of water to be sufficient as a preservative. Some solution may be added to advantage to the bookbinder's paste. Although I have mentioned but one kind of insect, this wash effectively against the others. Sorry, I was trying to rush there a little bit at the end, because I'm coming up to 30 minutes here, and I do apologize for taking so long, but I found it kind of interesting. I hope you'll find it interesting if you stuck with me. So it's 29 minutes. I'll end it there, and I'll be back another time with another essay. Thank you, Book 2.